In the darkest hours of Britain's fight for survival, when the sky above the English coastline seemed permanently scared by the roar of engines and falling fire, a silent army emerged, not on the front lines, not in cockpits, not in trenches, but in factories, barns, sheds, laundries, and abandoned workshops. It was an army that didn't carry rifles or wear uniforms, but held Britain's fate in their bare hands. This is the story of the women who worked in secrecy, under pressure, under bombs, and against every barrier placed in their way. It is the story of the women who built the legendary Spitfire, an aircraft that would alter the fate of the Second World War. Their names were rarely recorded, their contributions barely acknowledged, and yet history could not have moved without them. For 15 seconds, imagine the whirring of machinery, the trembling of the ground as bombs fall in the distance, and the ticking of the clock counting down to invasion. And now imagine a group of women stepping forward and saying, without hesitation, "We will build the weapon that defends our nation." Hello, welcome back to the channel. Today we uncover one of the most overlooked and powerful stories of World War II, a narrative buried beneath smoke, steel, and silence. The story of the women who built the Spitfire, and how their determination, skill, and courage became a hidden pillar of Allied victory. This is not the story of pilots in the sky, this is the story of hands at work, minds under pressure, and a generation of women who reshaped a nation's destiny from the inside out. The story begins long before the factories surged to life with the purpose of mass-producing fighter aircraft. Britain in the 1930s was a society caught between tradition and modernity. Women were still largely expected to remain in domestic roles, barred from most positions in engineering or skilled labor. Yet, as whispers of war turned into pounding certainty, the country faced an overwhelming challenge. How do you build enough aircraft to resist one of the most powerful militaries the world had ever seen? The Spitfire, designed by the brilliant yet notoriously stubborn engineer R.J. Mitchell, was a marvel of aviation, sleek, fast, agile, with wings so distinct that they carved their own legend in the sky. But its beauty was also its burden. The Spitfire required precise craftsmanship, delicate assembly, and an extraordinary level of detail. It couldn't simply be stamped out in giant factories like other machines. It demanded artisans. But artisans were in short supply. Many capable men were being drafted, pulled from workshops and engineering floors to fight. The aircraft industry needed skilled hands fast. That is when Britain turned to an unexpected reserve: its women. Most of them had never touched aircraft components before. Some had never held a tool beyond what was needed at home. And yet, thousands stepped forward. They were welders, riveters, grinders, file workers, painters, and assemblers. Some worked in official production plants, but many, especially those contributing to the Spitfire, worked in what became known as the shadow factories, hidden workshops meant to keep production going even under bombing threats. But one effort stands out in particular: the dispersal system that spread Spitfire construction across the small towns and villages of southern England. After German bombers targeted major factories, the government scrambled to decentralize production. That is when women across Salisbury, Southampton, Reading, Winchester, and countless other towns were asked to transform whatever space they could find into makeshift assembly points. They worked in laundries converted into panel shops, in garages turned into machining stations, in barns transformed into fitting halls. The Spitfire became a cottage industry. It was a machine of war built by the hands of civilians, piece by precise piece. Part 1 of this story lies in the human transformation that took place when ordinary women stepped into extraordinary roles. On the first day of work, many walked into factories overwhelmed by noise: hammers clinking, drills buzzing, metal shrieking as it was bent, shaped, welded, and riveted. Supervisors, often skeptical men, doubted whether women could handle detailed mechanical tasks. And yet within days, something remarkable happened. The women adapted, fast. Many had backgrounds in sewing, tailoring, or domestic crafts, which required precision, patience, and delicate control. These skills translated perfectly to aircraft work. Where brute force had once dominated, finesse now took command. A supervisor might assign a woman to fit a complex curvature of a wing frame, expecting her to struggle, only to watch her complete it with graceful efficiency. Word spread quickly. These women were not just adequate replacements, they were essential. Days were long, often stretching 10 or 12 hours, 6 days a week, sometimes 7. The air inside the workshops was thick with metal dust and the tang of paint. The women's hands became roughened, nicked with tiny cuts and burns. But the sense of purpose carried them. Many recall the moment they first saw a completed Spitfire roll out of assembly, painted, polished, and ready to fly. It wasn't just a machine. It was a piece of their soul. They knew that somewhere in the sky, a pilot would entrust his life to the integrity of their work. Outside the workshops, bombs fell. Air raid sirens wailed through the night. Families took shelter beneath trembling roofs. But the next morning, the women returned to their benches, their riveting stations, their assembly lines. Some buildings were destroyed mid-shift, killing workers. Production halted briefly while debris was cleared, then resumed with even more determination. The message was clear: the Spitfire must be built. Every hour mattered, and soon, production speed increased dramatically. A Spitfire that once took weeks to assemble could now be completed in days. Efficiency soared because the women who built them were not just working, they were innovating. They developed shortcuts, improved techniques, organized materials better, and held each other to exacting standards. Entire teams became like families. If one woman struggled with a task, another would step in to guide her. If someone missed a day due to illness or bombing damage at home, her team covered her work without complaint. They did not seek glory or recognition. Their motivation was simple and deeply personal. Loved ones were fighting in the sky. Now we enter part 2 of this unfolding story, where the connection between the factory floor and the battlefield becomes painfully clear. The pilots who flew the Spitfire were heroic, daring men whose names filled newspapers and posters. They were celebrated as knights of the sky, symbols of defiance during the Battle of Britain. But behind every sortie, behind every dogfight, behind every victory was the invisible network of women whose hands had shaped the aircraft. Many pilots later said that the Spitfire felt like an extension of their body, responsive, alive, almost intuitive. What they didn't always know was that those qualities were the result of meticulous work performed in tiny workshops by women who understood that a single misaligned rivet or a slightly warped panel could cost a life. During the Battle of Britain, the stakes were higher than ever. Britain was on the brink of invasion. German bombers pounded cities relentlessly. The RAF was losing aircraft faster than new ones could be delivered. Every Spitfire counted. Women on the production lines began working faster and deeper into the night, sometimes sleeping in the factories, sometimes refusing to go home even when air raid warnings sounded. They knew that pilots at the front needed their work. They could not allow the hangars to empty. The pressure was intense, the fatigue overwhelming, but morale remained astonishingly high. Some women left behind diaries or letters describing the emotional weight of their work. One wrote that every time she hammered a rivet into place, she imagined a pilot relying on that exact point of strength during a fight. Another described how she whispered silent prayers over the fuselage skins she polished, wishing protection upon whichever young man would soon sit inside. Many of the women were young themselves, barely in their 20s. Some had brothers or husbands in the RAF. Some lost loved ones but continued working, knowing it was the only way to fight back. There was also the unique story of the Spitfire girls, who worked in dispersal units like those led by Lord Beaverbrook and companies such as Hants and Dorset Aviation. These women didn't just assemble parts, they completed entire fuselages section by section. They fit wings, tested joints, filed sharp edges, and applied the distinctive elliptical wing curvature by hand. They learned the rhythm of the metal, the feel of perfect alignment, the resonance of a correctly set rivet. Their skill turned the Spitfire from a blueprint into a breathing machine, but their work extended beyond simple construction. Women also took part in dangerous ferry pilot roles, delivering aircraft from factories to airfields. Many of these pilots belonged to the Air Transport Auxiliary, a civilian organization that included women who flew dozens of aircraft types with minimal training. They navigated without radios or weapons, vulnerable to both weather and enemy fighters. Their courage ensured that newly built Spitfires reached the front fast enough to be put into action. As the war intensified, the role of women in Spitfire production grew even larger. By 1942, women made up more than half of the workforce in some aircraft plants. They were no longer novices, they were experts. Some became senior inspectors, responsible for final checks before approval. Their eye for detail was unmatched. A woman inspecting the curves of a wing might detect a subtle flaw invisible to others, and she would halt production until it was corrected. Lives depended on her judgment, and she never hesitated. Yet their work remained largely unrecognized. Newspapers spoke of war workers, but rarely specified the role women played. Many women later said they felt invisible in their own era, overshadowed by the heroism of the battlefield. But none regretted their contribution. They knew their value even if the world didn't. Part 3 brings us to the aftermath, the legacy, and the quiet triumph that would only be acknowledged decades later. When the war ended in 1945, the factories slowed. The machines powered down. Workers returned home. Many to find their wartime roles dissolved overnight. Men returned from the front and reclaimed their old positions. Britain's social expectations snapped back into place. Women were told gently, and sometimes harshly, that their work had been temporary. They were thanked with polite smiles and asked to resume traditional roles. Many complied, not because they lacked ambition, but because society gave them no other choice. But something deep had changed within them. They had tasted responsibility, precision, craftsmanship, purpose. They had seen the power of their contribution firsthand. They had stepped into a world that once excluded them, and had proven themselves indispensable. Their legacy became a quiet but permanent shift in Britain's industrial identity. The Spitfire itself lived on in legend. It became a symbol of courage, resilience, and resistance. It became the aircraft that saved a nation. But as decades passed, people began asking who built this masterpiece. Who shaped the wings that defended the coastline? Who hammered the metal that climbed into the sky? Only then did the truth begin to surface. Old photographs emerged, rows of women standing proudly beside half-finished fuselages. Diaries were discovered, memories were shared. Historians uncovered the full story of the cottage industry that had produced thousands of Spitfires under impossible conditions. Memorials were erected. Documentaries were filmed. The women who had once worked silently in shadow factories were finally acknowledged publicly as heroes of the Second World War. The rediscovery of their story is a powerful reminder that wars are not won solely by those who carry weapons. They are won by those who build, repair, supply, assemble, and support. They are won by hands that craft and hearts that endure. For every pilot who soared through the clouds, there were hundreds of women on the ground who made that flight possible. Today, when we look at surviving Spitfires displayed in museums or soaring at air shows, we see more than just stunning aircraft. We see the fingerprints of countless women whose names history nearly forgot. We see their strength in the curvature of the wings, their precision in the alignment of panels, their endurance in each rivet and seam. Every Spitfire carries their story. This script, like the aircraft itself, is a tribute to them, to the women who built the Spitfire, who changed the course of a war, and who forged a legacy of skill, courage, and silent heroism. They did not seek recognition. They sought victory. And in doing so, they became an essential chapter in the world's most defining conflict. Their story reminds us that sometimes the most powerful warriors are not those in uniform, but those who stand behind the machines that shape history. Their contributions remain etched into the metal wings of Britain's most iconic fighter, and into the memory of a world that they helped to save.